Passing along the Sea of Galilee, he saw Simon and Andrew, the brother of Simon, casting a net into the sea, for they were fishermen. They were fishermen. And Jesus said to them, "Follow me, and I will make you fishers of men." And immediately they left their nets and followed him. And going a little further, he saw James, the son of Zebedee, and John, his brother, who were in their boat tending their nets. And immediately he called to them, and they left their father Zebedee in the boat with the hired servants and followed him. This is the word of God for all people.
Well, once again, it's good to be with all of you today. I don't know who it was. I got told years ago I was not allowed to pray for snow because then we get lots of snow. And so someone prayed for rain recently, which is good because we probably needed it. We went from drought to monsoon, I think. But either way, it's a good day to be with you all. It's a good day to praise the Lord. And I'm excited to share with you a word from the Lord today. If you haven't been with us recently, over the last 5 months, we've been going through this season in the church called Ordinary Time. And Ordinary Time is, you'll never guess, it's when we talk about ordinary things. It's when we talk about what it looks like on an ordinary day to follow Jesus. And I haven't mentioned it that many times, but the reason we've been focusing on this thing called the church calendar, what is it? One of my friends that said, well, you're not a Catholic church, so why do you use the church calendar? I said, that's a good question. But in many ways, it's something that over the years it has been misused or abused or misunderstood at times. The church calendar is something you have to do or things you have to follow. But in other ways, it's also a beautiful way of how we rearrange our life. We rearrange our schedules around following Jesus. That's what it's intended to be. And that's what we're trying to use it as we prepare for the season of Advent coming up in a few weeks. We prepare for Lent that will come up in the spring. It's just how we rearrange our lives to follow Jesus. For some people it's helpful. For some people it's not helpful. But for those of us who it is helpful for, we try to emphasize that and use those for God's glory so we can continue to follow him more closely. So we're in ordinary time, but just for a few more weeks. This is the last subject, I should say, we're going to talk about with ordinary time before we move into our season of Advent in December. And so as you can see on the screen behind me, for the next 3 weeks, we'll be talking about disciple, what it means to be a disciple. Well, about 6 weeks ago, I got a call from my boss, not from God. I mean, God's my boss too, but I got a call from Pastor Steve, and he was checking in on me, saying hello. He was letting us know that the bouncy houses that were coming for Pumpkin Fest were on their way to their right location and not in Spearfish, South Dakota, miles away. And so we were talking about what was going on in the life of the church, and he asked me what I had been preaching about, and I told him specifically that previous Sunday we had been talking about our core value of multiplication and what that means about how we are called not just to, specifically as LifeBridge, not to just add on to our building and become this huge mega church, but specifically our calling was to plant churches. Our calling was to make disciples who multiply. And we're just beginning to talk about what that means. And I didn't know that it was a mistake to tell my boss that when he asked me. But through that conversation, I was introduced to this thing called the Exponential Multipliers Journey Cohort. And it's basically a group of pastors who are meeting over about a 6 or 7 month period. And it's kind of like taking a course. They meet 3 times in person throughout the country. And then over that time in between, they're learning things and reading the same things and praying and whatnot. And he told me about these gatherings. And when he finished, I realized that I was not interested in the least to be a part of them. First of all, because I finished my schooling 6 years ago. I got done with that. I had my degree. I was finished. I thought, great, I don't need to go to school anymore. This is beautiful. And so I was done with that part of my life. And also because I don't really care for traveling by myself. It's not, my neighbor travels 35 weeks a year through his work. And I said, no, I'm good. I don't need to travel. And so right when I was about to tell Pastor Steve, no, I don't think that's for me, he said 3 words that you always should be scared when someone tells you. He said, pray about it. And I said 4 words in response that were even more dangerous to say. I said, I will pray about it. I will pray about 5 words. I will pray about it. And as you can imagine, before long, I was signed up for this cohort of pastors, and I had our lead team's blessing to do so. So in the last month, I've been through about 8 or 10 hours of coursework, learning and praying and studying. And about 10 days ago, we had our first in-person meeting down in Fort Worth, Texas. Has anybody never been to Texas before? Could you raise your hand if you've never been to Texas? A couple of you never been to Texas? Okay, so most of you have been to Texas. I'd never been there before. I did not realize this, but I've come to believe that I think the story of the three little pigs originated in Texas. I think that's where it started at, specifically in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. And I'll tell you why. If you know the story, then you know that the big bad wolf goes from house to house of these three little pigs. And the first house he blows down because it's a house of straw. And the second house, the second little pig, he blows down because it's a house of sticks and wood. And he gets to the third house, the oldest pig. All the pigs run to his house, and the big bad wolf cannot blow it down because it's a house of brick. And eventually, at the end of the story, the big bad wolf runs away. He cannot defeat the three little pigs, and each three little pig has their own house of brick. I believe that because in Dallas-Fort Worth area, everything is made of brick. I don't know how they do it, but every fence, every gate, every house, every building, everything's made of brick. I don't know if they have a monopoly on brick or it's cheaper down there to buy or something, but everybody owns brick. They don't use wood, they don't use metal, everything is brick. And I don't think the big bad wolf has been seen for decades down there now because he can't do any work. But I didn't go down there just to see all the pretty brick down there. Specifically, I went to learn and to listen and to see what God had to teach me. And I've been impressed because many times conversations are about church strategy and how do we need to change and which cultural shifts are happening in our world and how do we need to adjust. And we talked about those things. But even more so, we talked about the importance of after we learn something, you don't go back to your home church and change everything because you've learned something new. Instead, you begin to pray and to fast and to say, Lord, how are you calling us to change? At that time, at this cohort in Fort Worth, we had time to literally, they said, listen, and what is Jesus saying to you? Time in silence. They talked about how Jesus' words are important, his promises are true, and how being and making Christ-like disciples are the most important things we can be doing. And so today, and over the next 6 months or so, you'll hear me referring to this cohort, this group of pastors who are gathering and learning. And so if there's anything that I say that sounds a little off, you can email Pastor Steve and say, what is he learning at this cohort? No, don't do that. But specifically, you can be praying for me as I learn. Another of our in-person meetings is in January, and the last one's in May. So I'm really excited about what God is going to teach me through it and what God's going to work in all of us as we listen to him. And together, I have 20-some other pastors with me in our section of the cohort, all over the country. Well, in line with what I've been learning about disciple making, today we're talking about Jesus calling people to be disciples. He didn't call his first disciples, he didn't call them to be pew warmers or chorus singers or political revolutionaries or social activists or moral conservatives or anything like that. He specifically called people to follow him and called them to be his disciples. And in turn, he promised he would make them fishers of people, fishers of men, and it changed their identity of who they were. And today we're going to be answering the first questions of many of these 3 weeks is, what is a disciple? And if you know me as a pastor, God speaks to me through the Holy Three of three things. It just happens to be that way. So the first thing today of what is a disciple, we find in our scripture that a disciple is first of all called. A disciple is called. A few weeks ago, Alicia and I attended a parent-teacher conference for Micah, our 5-year-old. And at first, I realized that I am a father of a 5-year-old, which makes me feel really old because I remember being in kindergarten, and now I also have a son who's in kindergarten. And my parents who used to talk about such things, they really aren't as old as they sounded when I was that age. But at that parent-teacher conference, I talked to Micah's teacher, and he informed me for the first time that one of Micah's classmates was moving across the country. He was going to be done, and his dad had a different job or whatever else, and they were moving across the country. And so that night, as Micah was getting ready to go to bed, we started talking about it. He was very sad that his friend was moving. And he, as a 5-year-old would, asked me, he said, Daddy, when are we going to move? And I didn't really know how to answer that question. It's a natural question. I should have been prepared for it. And so I responded. I said, well, buddy, I don't know when we're going to move, but I hope it's not for a very long time. And but I realized in that moment and this past week that most people understand that. Most people understand the calling of a pastor is that you go where God calls you to go. You go where God sends you next. Unfortunately, in the church, it always hasn't happened that way. Sometimes we feel the calling, which means I got mad at someone, or someone got mad at me, or the board got mad at a pastor. It doesn't always happen that way. Thankfully for me, it always has happened that way so far in my life. But we talk about that as a pastor's life, of a calling. What we don't often do is talking about following Jesus as a calling. We don't as often refer to ourselves as being called to follow Jesus. You see, whether or not we were raised in the church, no matter what our come to Jesus story looks like, if we're following Jesus, we were called to follow Jesus because disciples are called. Like it said in our call to worship this morning, we don't choose Jesus. We don't confront Jesus and have this amazing thing of, I know you, Jesus, I want to get to know you. But no, we love him because he first loved us. Before we even had any desire to follow Jesus, he came, he approached us, and then we were able to follow. In the Gospel of Mark, this is how it goes with the first disciples. I noticed this past week as I was reading through the first chapter, it's one of the first things Jesus does in the book of Mark. Mark was one of the first Gospels that was written. Matthew and Luke kind of took some notes off of Mark. But not much has happened before Jesus calls the disciples. I mean, John the Baptist is on the scene. Jesus gets baptized. Jesus has been in the wilderness for 40 days before this, being tempted by the devil. But as soon as John goes to prison, as soon as Jesus kind of begins this ministry, saying, repent, for the kingdom of God is near, one of the first things he does is call his disciples. He doesn't cast out a demon first. He doesn't heal someone. He doesn't even have some talk with the religious leaders saying, hey, here's what I'm going to do. Here's my plan. He calls his disciples first, which is an echo of what God had been doing for generations and generations. God doesn't just work in the world to restore humanity and the whole creation. He wants to partner with people to do it. He wouldn't have to, but God made a decision a long time ago that the kingdom of God would not come to earth without the participation of people. He wants to work with people, and so Jesus calls and called disciples. In our LifeBridge, our life groups here at LifeBridge, we've been talking about what it means to follow Jesus, practicing the way of Jesus as a lifestyle rather than just as a destination to heaven, trying to get there someday. And in the beginning of our study, we learned about how Jesus was not an ordinary rabbi. Most rabbis at that time, they didn't go around and have to say, hey, will you follow me? Will you follow me? Oh, no one wants to follow me. But as we talked about before, no, most rabbis would have these applications. All kinds of people, all sorts of students would say, oh, can I please be your disciple? And then the rabbis only a few would be selected to be a disciple, to follow them. Oh, that's not how it worked with Jesus. Jesus went to people who weren't even looking to be disciples, who knew they weren't going to be worthy of, on the top of their class, to be a disciple. And he went and he called them. He approached them. They did not approach him. Just like Christ first loved us, we don't first love Christ. And as I thought about it this week, Christianity is very, very similar in that way. Christianity is different than any other religion of the world. And every other religion in the world, people are trying to make their way to God. That's what religion means, trying to get to God, be good enough, obedient enough to God. And yet, that's not the way it works with Jesus. God the Father's always been moving toward people. Jesus didn't wait till people got their act together before he called them. Thank the Lord. Not only was the method by which Jesus called people different, but the people Jesus called were different. I mean, if you look around the room, look at your neighbor, you can tell the people of God's calls are different. You can tell your neighbor you're different. It's all right. But not only to call different, he also called people that were not the best and the brightest. Don't tell your neighbor they're not the best and the brightest. They are. But he did not call the best and the brightest. He called people who were insignificant from an insignificant region of the world to follow him. Just about the time I'm pretty proud of myself for being called to follow Jesus or called to be a pastor, I remember that Jesus did not call the most significant people in the world. He called perhaps the lowest at times people who are not worthy that no one else wanted, maybe. Those who responded to him are called disciples. Here at LifeBridge, that's part of our mission. The calling, we label it as encountering the grace of Jesus. That's what we call it in our mission. That's the first step, encountering the grace of Jesus. Others calling it being with Jesus or accepting the life that God gives. But encountering the grace of Jesus does not mean we've done anything to deserve it, but it does mean that we're probably insignificant. As we receive, something amazing happens and we're transformed. What is a disciple? A disciple is called. Secondly, a disciple is all in. All in. In college, I learned for the first time how to play the Texas Hold'em version of poker. I did not go to Mid-American Nazarene University, in case you wondered. I went to the pagan school, Mount Vernon Nazarene University. But I learned how to play poker in college, and I quickly found my freshman year that poker was not designed for people like me. It is not made for people like me at all. I'd never been to Texas, but evidently they played it down there because it was named after the state. And I'd never been there at that point in my life. But the first reason that Texas Hold'em was not made for me is because I am not a gambler. I don't gamble in any way, and therefore, why am I going to give you $1 if you're not going to give it back to me? Or I'm not guaranteed they're going to give it back to me with interest. Why would I put my money in the center of the table? That's crazy. My wife thought she was frugal, I've told you before, until she married me and realized that you can actually pinch the penny tighter than she thought you could. So I'm not a gambler. Secondly, I'm not good at bluffing. If I lie to you, you know it. I'm not good at games where you have to pretend you're winning when you're really not winning. It must be a good thing or a God thing, but not if you're playing poker. It's not a good thing because people know you really don't have 2 aces in your hand. You have a 2 and a 5 or a queen or whatever is bad. I don't remember. And thirdly, I'm bad at poker because I don't like taking risks. In poker, if you're going to win the game, at some point you have to take a risk. Otherwise, either the game never ends or you never lose, or you probably will lose the game at some point. And the good news about playing Texas Hold'em in Mount Vernon Nazarene University was because several of my friends also, poker was not designed for them. We never gambled money or anything. We just put chips on the table. And even then, I'm like, well, I like that chip. I don't want to give it to you. I still have a hard time with that. But that was a good thing. The bad thing was that because many of us were so similar, the game of poker never ended because we were never willing to take risks. We never put more chips on the table or whatever else. We were afraid to do that. If you're unaware, one of the most exciting parts in poker is when someone goes all in. They put all their chips on the table, which I'm not sure I ever did that before. You put all your chips on the table, you say, I am all in, which means if I don't have the best cards and someone else plays, then I've lost the game. I'm completely out. I've lost everything. Nothing is left. At least that person claims to have the best combination in the game. Going all in is a pretty big deal in Texas Hold'em poker. Going all in life is hard to do, but when we become a disciple of Jesus, we go all in. Whether we knew it or not, whether someone explained it to us or not, that's what being a disciple means. That's what it meant for the first disciples. The Coffee and Connect question today was, what's the longest journey you've ever taken? What's the longest trip you've ever taken? For some of you, you may have never been out of the state of Minnesota before. I don't know, but that's something beautiful and nostalgic about that. For some of you, maybe you don't know because your whole life is one big trip and you come home for a couple of weeks, you're gone again, and you don't really have a home. And so there's something perhaps beautiful about that too. But for me, I'll just share one of the trips I've been on. About 6 months after Brooklyn was born, Alicia's parents had invited us to go on a trip to Maine. And so it was the first time we traveled with two young children on a plane, and we traveled to Maine. And when we went there, we decided we wanted to go whale watching. Has anyone gone whale watching before? A few have gone? Yeah, so if you've gone whale watching, you know you don't see the whales from the shore. It doesn't work that way, at least not where we went. You have to get on a boat or a ship, and you go out into the water quite a ways in order to see these animals. And for us, we boarded a boat and went about 50 miles into the Atlantic Ocean, which doesn't seem like that far at first. But when you're on the Canadian border and you're out in the middle of nowhere and you look around you, and there's water over there, and there's more water over here, and if you get thirsty, you can't drink it probably because it's not good for you. You look around and you think, I wonder if anybody else knows how to drive this boat. Like if the captain has a heart attack or something happens, you realize in those moments, I realize that cruises may not be in my future. I was like, I'm not sure if I can do this. At some point when you take a long journey like that, you are all in. There's no turning back. It's like that old saying goes, you've made your bed, now lie on it. I didn't really know that saying very well because I watched I Love Lucy as a child, and Ricky Ricardo said, you made your bed, now go and take a nap. And I didn't know what that meant. But it means that you are all in. You've decided you're not turning back now. You've got on the boat. You're out to sea. You can't go back. I can't control anything. I am completely out of control here. And if they decide to stay an extra hour like they did, and you don't have enough formula or anything for your child, which we didn't at the time, you can't control it. You can't decide when you go back or when you come forward, when you can't go anywhere. You just have to stay because the captain's in charge now of the boat. You can't go anywhere. Although we don't recognize it, there are many times in life where we have to decide if we're all in or they're going to fold. Sometimes there's not an in-between at times. Becoming a disciple is when you decide, I'm all in on following Jesus. Jesus called his first disciple, he called Simon and Andrew. Simon, who we know more like Peter in our world today. He also called James and John a few verses later. And when Jesus calls them, again, a very rare thing to do, they are all in. Immediately they begin to follow him. Many scholars believe that Jesus had lived in the same town or in the same area for a while. And so the disciples already knew who he was. They'd already had an idea about what he was about. They probably heard him started preaching. They knew about John the Baptist. Each disciple leaves their occupation and immediately follows Jesus. Simon and Andrew leave their boats. James and John, they leave their boats and their father and their hired men. And at first when I read this, it looked like they left their boats. They never went fishing again. It was over. Everything changed. I said, how is that possible? But as I've been reading and studying, it seems that many scholars agree that, yes, they changed their life, but they didn't necessarily never go fishing again. We find throughout the Gospels they go fishing from time to time, or it seems like anytime Jesus needs a boat, he always has a boat available to him. They may not necessarily have sold all their stuff, forsaken all their family forever, but what they did do, definitely, is they made following Jesus their priority. They didn't just go fishing whatever they wanted to anymore. They no longer asked their family for permission to do things if Jesus told them to do something. They got on the boat when Jesus said, get in the boat. Everything else was secondary in their lives because they were all in. Over the last couple of weeks, I've made dozens of phone calls, which I don't mind doing. Dozens of phone calls from people who attended Pumpkin Fest. And Barb's been making them, and Pastor Jane and I have been making them. And it was a miracle because nearly half the people I called actually answered the phone. If they didn't answer the first time or the second time or the third time or the fourth time, eventually they answered the phone. I didn't call them 5 times, but eventually they answered the phone, which was a miracle in itself. But this time I felt specifically called. I had the opportunity to ask each one of them a list of questions, and one of them was, would you like to hear more about Jesus or learn more about what the church believes, maybe have coffee with a pastor? And 5 people I talked to said yes. And I don't know if I wasn't having enough faith, but I was not expecting that. I said, oh, that's never happened before. What do I do now? What does that mean? I said, okay, great. Well, I'll text or call you next week, and we'll schedule something. 5 people said yes. And so this past week I was preparing about what I'm going to do when I have coffee or when I have Coca-Cola with someone or someone who drinks Pepsi, and I don't know how to be in their presence when they drink a Pepsi-Cola. But I decided one of the things that I learned through this cohort, one of the pastors who spoke to us said they do 4 things when they meet with someone. I said, hey, I'm going to do those 4 things. I'm going to ask that person what their story is. I'm going to share my story in a bridged version. I'm going to share with them the gospel, and then I'm going to say, do you have any questions about Jesus or about the church or whatnot? I thought that's a great plan. Well, I was preparing, as I'm a preparer, I realized that I cannot share a 30-minute gospel presentation sermon in this coffee shop. That may not go over very well. So I thought, okay, what version of the gospel am I going to share? And so first, in my mind, I thought, okay, it's the normal gospel. God made the world. Humans sinned. We all know that. Jesus died on the cross. Eventually, hey, Jesus offers forgiveness. Would you like to be forgiven for your sins? Do you want to go to heaven someday? And as I began to think about that, I realized I read this text. That's not the question that Jesus asked his disciples. He didn't go up to them and said, would you like to go to heaven someday? He didn't say, would you like to enter the kingdom of God? That was not the question he asked them. Instead, he invited them and said, come follow me. And I thought to myself, what am I inviting these 5 people to do? Am I going to ask them if they want to accept Jesus into their life? And if they say yes and come to church, then do I ask them later, well, now do you want to follow Jesus? That's not the order Jesus did it in. Jesus invited people to life change, take it or leave it, all in. It didn't just apply when they died. It was something that affected their life now. I realized, I hadn't really thought about it until the last few months, or maybe the last few years, that I grew up learning the gospel. I knew about the gospel, but I learned about sharing the gospel. I didn't necessarily invite people to follow Jesus. I was not invited to follow Jesus. I asked if I wanted my sins forgiven. I said yes. You see, I realized that I was potentially inviting people to ask for forgiveness of their sins, but I was not inviting them to be freed from the power of sin and to live for Jesus. I didn't really see the difference. I didn't really think about it. I thought, well, that's sanctification, right? And then I looked at these disciples and I thought, wait a minute. They may not have known what was all incorporated right away, but they followed Jesus. They were invited that day to follow him, and they just became disciples. I wonder sometimes if I try to short-circuit the process so I can get more people to be converted, and I say that's great, but I haven't really made any disciples along the way. This all-in nature is reflected in our mission in the transform part. As we experience the grace of Jesus, as we respond to that, then we experience transformation. We encounter God's grace, then we experience transformation. We become something different. Romans 12 says we can be transformed by the renewing of our minds, and it changes everything, not just our eternal address. It means that we perhaps are willing to take the accountability challenge. I didn't want to give all of you 2 weeks ago, but I did anyway. The accountability challenge is say, will you go to a close friend or relative and ask them, in what ways am I being a hypocrite? Something that we don't like to do. It means that we consider the perspectives of other people around us, people that we disagree with, people that we think they're happy when I'm sad because this happened, I'm glad about it, and they're not. People that we look around them and their lives are completely different. Perhaps they have something to teach me if they're following Jesus too. Way too often I share the gospel as I do you want to get to heaven, but in reality it's more like, do you want your whole life to be uprooted? Do you want to follow Jesus? Are you willing to lay down your cross? A disciple is called, and a disciple is all in. Thirdly, Jesus says a disciple fishes for people. A disciple fishes for people. Well, at this time at LifeBridge, usually a little earlier in the sermon, but every week of course you already know, we sit at round tables if you haven't figured that out yet, but we also take about 4 or 5 minutes, and we relate to what we're talking about in the sermon. We take some round table discussion time, and it's not required, but you're invited to answer a question to kind of process through what we're talking about. And so it's a time where you don't need to share your life story. You don't even need to share a personal story. We just talk in general about the world or our culture or the church. And so this is the question you're invited to talk about today. What are some possible reasons or excuses that people following Jesus don't make disciples? In other words, why do many Christians not fish for people? We don't do it very often. Why do most Christians not fish, as research tells us? Either we don't share our faith, or we think it's okay if we haven't made a disciple in a few years. Why do we do that or not do that? So again, you don't need to necessarily share your personal story. You can if you want to. But share in general, perhaps, why do you think we don't share our faith? So anyway, take a few minutes, discuss that. You're invited to, and we'll come back in a few minutes and we'll continue on and finish up with the message. Let's take time to do that right now. Easy question to answer, but I do appreciate you taking some time to talk about why we don't do that as followers of Jesus many times. Fishing for people. Well, fishing for fish is a fairly common occupation in the world, especially at that time. in Mark chapter 1. But even now, it's fairly common for people to be fishermen. It looks a little different. It's very important in many economies of the world, and I don't necessarily like the type or don't like the taste of all fish, but I appreciate the benefits. It's good for you to eat fish. I do it sometimes. I eat fish because it is good for me. However, even though I enjoy fish and I appreciate the people who do it, I've told you this before, I am not a fisherman. I've never had a purely joyful experience with a fishing pole in my hand. It's never happened before. I think fishing takes too long, and it gets too messy, and it doesn't taste good enough for all the work you go into it to do it. I'm like, why don't you just go buy the fish? Someone else has done the work, and they've caught hundreds of them. Why would you catch one at a time? It does not seem enjoyable to me. I've never actually had the desire or said out loud, it's a nice day today, let's go fishing. I've never said that before. But I think deep down inside, as I was reflecting this week, it still tastes bad to say it out loud. I think deep down inside, if I did it, I probably would enjoy fishing. It just tastes bad even to say that out loud, I know. I think I would enjoy it. Because if you're out there in a boat or on the shore and you're by yourself, you're in nature, it's probably a beautiful time just to reflect or to pray or whatever else. I mean, you're sitting there for a while. And if you're with someone else, what a beautiful way to build a relationship. Or it's like having coffee. I can bring coffee and fish probably. And it just seems like a thing that I would really enjoy doing. But when I think about going fishing, I don't think about that. I think of the fact that I need to hold on to this fish. It's probably his teeth are going to cut my hand. I'm going to have to scrape all the scales off and all the process. I don't even know all the things you do. I don't think about those ways. It's probably the last thing I want to spend my time doing on a nice, beautiful day is to go fishing. And I think the same things happens in the church. We don't want to go fishing for people. It does not sound enjoyable. It's not something like, I have a free Saturday. Let's go and share my faith today. Let's go and do this, wherever it may be, with a friend of mine, wherever it is. It doesn't have to be door to door. In my experience, something strange has happened, at least in the United States, where I live. We've somehow separated being a disciple of Jesus from making disciples, as though we can do one without the other. Unfortunately, Jesus didn't really give his disciples that option. And I realized I wasn't just preaching a sermon for other people to hear, that it was primarily for me to hear, because I'm no exception. I like to talk about our mission. I like to talk about encountering God on a Sunday morning. I love talking about encountering God in a prayer closet, being transformed and having God change my life. Now, I even enjoy making friends with fish. I love, not real fish, I know, with people. I love making friends with people who don't know Jesus. I enjoy those processes. But intentionally, unashamedly, inviting someone to follow Jesus, where if they realize that perhaps that's what I want them to also follow, if I think that's best for them, may they misunderstand and they think, hey, that's all he wants me for, is to be part of his church. Am I willing really to break that relationship possibly to invite them to follow Jesus? I realize that I enjoy building bridges, but I don't necessarily enjoy building bridges to Jesus all the time. And there's a huge difference between those two. I'm really good at building bridges. I love building relationships with people. I love building friendships. And although there's joy in it, I haven't done it enough to where I build enough bridges to Jesus specifically. Making disciples compared to just reaching people and loving on people, which is important also. You see, this is what Jesus calls his people to do. Jesus called his first disciples not just to be people who they're going to fish for people once in a while, then you can go back to fishing most of the time. But he called disciples to make fishing the reason they lived and didn't just die and go to heaven. He said, learn to be a disciple, get to know me, and then also make disciples. If nothing else, those are the two things that Jesus invited his disciples to do, and they said yes. Jesus was changing the vocation of these fishermen, and he wasn't just adding a hobby already onto their busy lives, he was changing everything. You know, if the 12 disciples who first followed Jesus, if they wouldn't have made any disciples, things would not have gone very well. They could have done everything right and continued to follow him and got to know him well, and things wouldn't have gone very well. They would have disobeyed Jesus and the core thing he taught them to do. They may not have really been disciples, because how can you be a disciple and not, that's what it means to follow Jesus. And I realized this, that it's impossible virtually impossible for a professional fisherman to go their whole lives and never catch a fish. A professional fisherman, that would be impossible. If there was just a hobby, like it's not even my hobby, once in a while I might fish, okay, I may never catch a fish in my whole life because I don't fish often enough, right? But if you were a professional fisherman, that's what you did. You wouldn't be guaranteed every time to go catch a fish, but at some point you're going to catch something. Why is that? It's because there are plenty of lakes and oceans and rivers in this world that are full of hungry fish. I wonder if the same is true in our world. If God has called us, if Jesus has invited us to follow him, and we said, yes, I want to be a disciple of Jesus, then it's impossible for us to go our whole lives and never actually make a disciple. Because even though I doubt Jesus sometimes, he said the harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. There are plenty of people in the world that are hungry for Jesus, even if they don't know his name yet. There are people in the world that are waiting, and Jesus said the problem isn't that we don't have enough fishing poles to go around. The problem isn't that there aren't enough fish to catch. The problem is there aren't enough people who have made fishing their occupation. But instead, if you're like me, you've made fishing a hobby that you like to do while you make friends of fish all around you. How can I go my entire lifetime and never make a disciple? Well, it could only happen if I am not a fisherman myself. It can probably only happen if I've left the fishing up to the experts, perhaps, to those who are really called, but then I forget that all disciples are called. And if we follow Jesus, that means we're all in. There are no more chips left on the table. It means that whether or not I've quit my job or left my family thousands of miles away, whether I've never left Minnesota or whether my life is a consistent travel, regardless, those disciples didn't have to give up everything and never fish again. They fished some, but they had to make everything else secondary to following Jesus and making disciples. And if we do that, it's impossible for us. We will catch a fish sometime. It's virtually impossible because there are enough fish in the world. Jesus said, "Come, follow me. Encounter my grace." We didn't choose him, he chose us. And we just said yes as followers of Jesus. He said, "Come, follow me, and I will make you become. Change your identity, become something you are not. You'll be transformed if you respond to this encounter." He said, "Come, follow me, and I will make you fishers of men, fishers of people." You'll go and build bridges to Jesus where there were not before. You'll throw out a line where there was no line before. That's our one job. And if we know that, then we're going to catch fish sometime. In my life, I've helped to lead one person to follow Jesus who was not following Jesus before that. And that in my life happened in the last 6 months. I wasn't the person that was at the altar praying this prayer and everything changed immediately. It was over the course of several months where this person went from "I don't believe in God" to now this person, eventually that person said, "Yeah, I believe in Jesus, but I don't know if I want to follow him." And now that person said, "Oh yes, I follow Jesus," and they're always learning and wanting to learn more and more and more. Why I've only caught one fish? I'm a pastor. I'm called in many different ways, but I haven't caught many fish because I haven't made fishing my vocation. I've made pastoral ministry my vocation. I've made making friends with fish my vocation, but I haven't made fishing my vocation. It's a hobby, therefore I'm not probably going to catch many fish if I'm not out fishing very often. You see, fishing doesn't necessarily mean that we have to go door to door to our neighbors and the first time we meet them explain the gospel and the 4 spiritual laws and whatnot like I learned as a child. It might mean that. But it does mean that we're praying for people around us. It means we're praying either for our one that we've talked about before in our lives. It means we're praying for the opportunity, and it means that we're sensitive enough to the Holy Spirit. And when he says get in the boat, we get in the boat, we share about Jesus. When he says to get out of the boat, we get out of the boat. When he says your life is too busy, we take things away because we don't have time to share our faith anymore. It means we're all in. Every week at LifeBridge, we leave with a final question. And I don't know about you, but the final questions are getting harder. I'm not sure I like this idea of a final question anymore. That was a joke, sorry. The final question this morning is this. Actually, two questions. How many fish have you caught? And why do you think that is the case? For me, I've caught one fish. And I can tell you why that's the case. It's because I haven't made fishing very important. How many disciples have you made? Now, how many people have said yes to Jesus? That's important, yes. But how many people have not said yes to Jesus and it didn't just mean I want to go to heaven when I die? Sure, I'll agree with that. I can get a lot of people to agree with that. But that's like catching the fish on the hook and then we switch the bait afterwards. If you're not currently following Jesus, the answer is pretty easy. You probably haven't caught many fish because you're not following Jesus. The question for you today, if you don't follow Jesus, is, do I want to follow Jesus? Do I believe it's worth it? If you are following Jesus today, these questions are probably more pertinent to you and maybe more difficult. Maybe you're like me and you haven't caught many fish. You haven't made many disciples. You're waiting for the church to make disciples. It may not be very natural to you. Maybe no one explained to you that when you accepted Jesus, that meant you're all in. Well, if no one told you that, I'm sorry, but I just told you, so ignorance is no longer bliss. Maybe you used to catch fish, but you don't anymore. Whether because you're too busy now or life changed. The type of fishing we're talking about never stops until we die. We keep fishing. It may look differently. Fishermen who get older, they don't necessarily cast the line anymore, but just help gather in the fish, perhaps. Or they teach others how to catch fish because they've been doing it for a while. Maybe you don't feel like you know how to catch a fish. But I think the first step to recovery we find is admitting there's a problem. I don't know how to do this. Maybe you're sitting down, you're thinking, hey, I want to share the gospel, and you realize you don't even know what gospel you're going to share. That's okay. I think we have to start the conversation with, I'm not sure how to share my faith. I'm not sure when to share my faith. I don't even have any friends that could share my faith with. It talks about being honest and not just pretending like everything's okay. Because following Jesus is not like playing poker. It's okay not to bluff. I'd love to learn with you. Jesus said, come follow me, and I will make you fishers of men, fishers of people. I may be pretty weak at that and not very good. But what we believe is that the Spirit of the Lord is strong in us and He can do the things we can't do. That's why we say yes to Him. So as we always do at LifeBridge, we're going to take a couple minutes to reflect, to pray. There'll be some quiet music playing in the background. Just take some time to ask the Lord. Maybe you need to reflect and say, Lord, have I caught any people? Do I see people who went from they don't even believe in God to now they are following Jesus? Have I been part of the process along the way at all? What are you asking me to change about my life? It's a dangerous thing to ask. But I'm asking you, pray about it. If you do, life might be changed some. We'll close in a few minutes with a song. Let's take some time to pray.